Hey there, and welcome again. In this lecture we will be adding the variables to our game mode that we created previously. So to do this, if you're not already in the blueprints folder, just make sure you move on over there and we will open the BP game mode. Now in this lecture we'll be adding most of the variables. There's a few that we're going to come back to in later lectures, but I just wanted to stick with the standard variable types for now so it doesn't get too confusing regarding what we're adding. And we're not going to be using them for a little while, but this just means that when we do need the variables, when we start making the other parts of the game, they will be readily available for us to use. Okay, so if we begin, the variables can be located over here, just in case we've forgotten that. And what we will be doing, as I've said, this will be where we store a lot of the variable types that the entire game will need, but may not necessarily be specific to certain blueprints. So the first thing we want to track is a boolean, remembering that the boolean is a true-false check, and anytime that a lot of people add booleans, what they do is they give it a lowercase b, again to represent the boolean, and then they give it the variable's name, and in this case it will be player dead. So this will be a check for whether or not the player has died, because if we remember, the boolean is a simple true or false check. We know this is a boolean because the color of the node over here is red, but we can double check that up here with the variable type, and it says here boolean, so that's great. So we've got our first one set for us. Next we want to create a variable to track the spawning interval for when we add the enemy spawner to the game. So we'll add a second variable and we will just call this spawn interval. Now, as I said, that's checking the interval between the spawning times of the enemies. So a time isn't a set value, it can't be a whole number. So what we need that to be is a float. So if we move it over to the variable type over here, and we can make that a float value. So that is our spawn value set. And now this is something which is quite handy to know. The next set of variables that we make are all going to be integers. And any time that you know that you have a certain number of the same type of variables to make, it's good to do those in order, because the way that the editor works is if we create a variable now, we'll make our first one and we'll call this live enemies. So this will keep track of the number of living enemies in the game. You'll notice that the variable type is the same green as the previous one, so this means this is still a float value. So the way the editor works is it will default the next variable you make to be the same type as the last variable. So it just saves a little bit of time from going over and changing the variable types if you can just make a whole list of them in one go. So if we hit enter to make sure that we've got that name set, and then go over here and change this to an integer, which is that turquoisey colour. And also you may have noticed every time you create a variable in a new blueprint it defaults it to be a boolean. Okay, so anyway, we need several integers now. So the next thing we want is to check the max number of waves we're going to have in the game. So max waves will be the variable name. We then want to keep track of the current wave that we're on, so we'll have the active wave check. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, we're going to be keeping track of the player's score in here, so we'll have a score variable. And all of these can be integers again, because we're not going to have 2.5 enemies alive or 3/4 of an enemy alive. We're always going to have 2 enemies or 3 enemies. And the same for the score. We're going to have 100 points, 200 points, and so on. The next variable we want will be the coins earned. And lastly, we just want a variable just for this blueprint, which will be coins. Okay. So we now have most of our variables. The next one that we want to make is something called a vector. So I'll go into a bit more detail on what a vector is once we've made them. If we just name this for now, so we want an enemy spawn location min. So this will be the lowest point on the screen that the enemy will be able to be spawned in at. And as I said, we want 2 vectors now. So if we go over here and we'll change this to a vector. And I'll just add the other one in, and then as I said, I'll give you a quick idea of what these are. Now, because the next variable is named so similarly, what we can do is we can click on the minimum variable, press Ctrl W, and that will copy it. That will also make another vector, and then we can just remove the minimum and rename that maximum or max. So this will be the highest point on the screen that the enemy can spawn. Now notice, I've mentioned this before, but notice over here that we have a please compile the blueprint command here. So if we do that, then we can start getting and seeing the variables. So this will be the true or false, so ticked as true, empty as false, whether the player is dead. We'll start that as false, because obviously we don't want to bring the character into the world and kill them straight away. The spawn interval, so as I said, is a decimal value over here, so we can have it spawn every 1.5 seconds or 1.1 second, but we're going to leave that as 0 for now, so that will be fine. And then these are our whole numbers down here, so these will be the variables that we mentioned previously. Now the new type that we're looking at is the vector. So a vector is simply made up of 3 float values, and you have your x, y and z. And if that seems familiar, that's because we've been placing things like the sun in the sky sphere have been placed at the x, y and z. So the location is simply a vector 3. The rotation is vector 3, as is the scale. And you do get different types of vectors as well. You can get a vector 2, which is 2 float values, and you can get a vector 4, which is 4 float values. The vector 4 comes in use more with the materials, because that then gives you your alpha value, your red, your green and your blue. But for the vector 3, this will be able to represent a location in the world on the x, the y and the z axis, which will be up, down, left, right, forward and backwards. So that's why we have a vector 3, and that's why it's for the spawn locations, because that will then allow us to place things into the world at those points. So hopefully that makes sense. These are all of the values that we need at the moment. As I said, there's another variable that we do need to add, but I want to leave that value, that variable, and add that when it becomes more relevant, because it's not a standard variable. Whereas all of these, the boolean, the float, the integers and the vectors, these are all very standard concepts. You'll see these if you were to go to a different game engine or a different language. You will see these appear in a very similar way, if not exactly the same almost. Whereas the last variable that we're going to create, which will be regarding the save system, is very Unreal specific. Now the only other thing we need to do before we wrap this lecture up is also recap on when I've been saying global, also known as the public variables, and the local variables. We need to make some of these public. Other things we'll need to know about them. So the enemy spawner we make later, we need to know where it's going to spawn the enemies. So we'll make the enemy spawn locations public, and we can do that by clicking this eye over here. So if the eye is open and yellow, it's public, which means other blueprints can see it. If it is closed, then it's local, which means only the game mode will be able to see it. In a similar way, the player is going to need to know whether or not he's currently dead, which seems a bit strange, but it makes a lot more sense when we've started implementing this functionality, why it's going to be the game mode controlling that and not the player blueprint itself. We're then going to make the spawn interval public for the same reasons down here. The enemy manager that we make needs to know when to spawn the enemies. And then the last 3 things we want to make public, we will have the max waves, the active wave and the current score will all be public. Everything else can stay private, which is the other term for a local variable, is a private variable. So that means it's private, and again, only this blueprint can see it. If it's public, then anything else can see it if it has a reference to this blueprint. So if that's done, we can compile and save the game mode. That is now ready for implementation into the game. That will be the next lecture. I look forward to doing that, and I will see you there.